My name is Clifford Pickett, and I'm here to talk to you today about advanced techniques for post-processing your images inside of Lightroom. I've done several classes here. You're free to look them up. Last week, we were just doing how to speed up Lightroom, which is very important. I would say that's even foundational. But this is something that this is like the candy of photography right here, right? It's taking your images and making them look beautiful. And if you've seen some of my other presentations, I welcome you to go check them out if you haven't. I typically go through and show people the before and after. I'm going to do that again to help you understand a little bit about what's possible. But there isn't always enough time to go through and actually show you how I do it. It's more, and it's actually most important to know that it's possible, because a lot of people don't think it's possible, right? Then they take it into Photoshop, they take it on their software, and it gets unnecessarily complicated. It doesn't have to be that way. Like, that's my whole mission with this, is to simplify things as simple as possible, right? So today, I'm not just going to show you the before and after. I will do that, but I'm also going to walk you through some of the decisions I make, some of the processing sliders, adjustments, and then we'll go into a little bit more advanced techniques as well. All right? So this is going to be my, actually, while I have that up, that's my info. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about this. The slides, any of the presentation, I can send you a link to. It's going to be posted on B&H Event Space website as well. But I'll say in advance, if you have any questions, do feel free to reach out anytime. I answer all my emails. I love helping people out. This is why I do this. So definitely reach out. So the before and after, because it's helpful to get an idea as to what's possible. For those who have seen the B&H Optic event presentation I did a couple weeks ago, I showed a few of these images. I was just talking about this before we went live. Does anyone recognize this? This is Banff up in Canada, Banff Lodge. So this is one of the images that I'll be editing. But the idea is just to show you where we wind up and where we start. Right? So that's the after and that's the before. And I kind of reversed it to show people, they'll see these images and then they'll say, all right, well, it doesn't look like this on the back of my camera. I must be a terrible photographer, right? Who feels like that sometimes? That's how I felt when I started too. So again, it doesn't have to be, hit you over the head. It can be very subtle. I do tend to exaggerate a little bit, mostly because I like saturated colors, but also because it makes for a better presentation. I want to be able to actually show you the power. But it doesn't have to be crazy complicated. A lot of these actually, after I make these adjustments, I save them as a preset, and I just apply them afterwards. So again, before and after. Right, this is the stitch panel. I'll show you how to do that as well. It's one way that we can use to increase the resolution of our files. So if you have a camera that's 12 megapixels like the iPhone that I use for almost all my photography these days, or 24 megapixels, don't think you have to go out and buy a 50 megapixel camera. You can, that's great. We're in the right store for it. So, come to B&H if you want to, but also what you have is probably going to be good enough, right? That's the before, that's the after. This is one I'll be editing as well. And then cropping even makes a big difference, right? We're bringing some colors out. We're changing the dynamic of the image. We're kind of showing people what's important. To me, that's photography. We look at the entire world, everything in our field of view, and we say, look at this. This is important. Stop and look at this. And we can emphasize that in Lightroom. So the goal is not to completely change our images. The goal is to enhance our images. And the reason that's the case, and the reason why we need to do that, is because if we're doing this properly, there's this concept of getting it right in camera. It's a little bit misleading to take that out in face value, because it's not necessarily the idea of getting it right in camera, meaning that's the final result, right? To me, getting it right in camera means you're getting the right ingredients, much the way a chef would go out and get the finest vegetables and fruits and ingredients to cook the finest foods. So that's what getting it right in camera means. It means getting the right composition, getting there in the right light, nailing focus. But the colors, I could not get this, for instance, in the camera. You don't get this in the camera. What you get are the raw ingredients, right? A chef doesn't walk into a supermarket and say, this is the best lasagna ever. No, he goes to a market, he gets all the raw ingredients, and then he cooks, right? Or she cooks. And the point is that you always start with the best ingredients, but you need to cook it, right? And When you get to a point where you understand how to do this, you get a little more familiarity with it, then it starts to become second nature. Then it starts to influence the decisions you make at the point of capture. And that's the whole point of this, is to understand at the point of capture that this is technically the perfect exposure because I'm not blowing out the highlights. And then I can come back and I can get something like that. But I would never know to make that decision then unless I knew at the time of capture that this is what I need to do and this is what I can do in post-processing. It comes full circle. So just some before and after shots. That's Death Valley, right? Notice the crop again, it's a cinematic crop. I'll show you how to do that. It's a crop ratio of 2.39 to 1. It's an anamorphic ratio. But you're just removing, photography often is about the art of removal, right? You're just minimizing and minimizing. Someone's told me the perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away, right? So cropping is a great tool to do that. You just remove and remove and remove. So these are some other before and afters. Most of these are just iPhone shots, actually. And the concept is to help you understand Lightroom. This is a question I get often as well, is when do I use Lightroom and when do I use Photoshop? Someone just emailed this a few days ago. I've been using Photoshop my whole life. Why should I use Lightroom? And the answer is it doesn't replace Photoshop at all. Adobe doesn't sell you Lightroom and then Photoshop. They sell the photographer's kit as a bundle for a reason. This question?
I'm just wondering if all of the edits have been done in Lightroom or if...
Yeah, the question is, have all the edits been done in Lightroom? Yes. Yeah, that's the point, is to show you. Like, it doesn't have to be this, hit you over the head, but just an image like this. It's very simple. This is just shot with a basic phone. But you're just bringing out the color and the detail, right? I'm eliminating everything that's distracting, and I'm cropping in, I'm bringing out the texture and the detail. That's all. And a lot of these, because it's in Lightroom, it's a recipe. In other words, it's just code. So I can apply that to other images. It means I can create a preset, and I can just burn through my presets and see which one applies. All right, before now, this is Soho. We just did, there's a few of you here that were in the Soho photo walk that I recognize. So that's from Soho. This is in Soho as well. All right, it's just subtle changes, but you notice the difference there? You're just bringing out the color. Why does this work? Because there's fundamental ways in which we can process our images that take advantage of the way humans interact with the visual world, right? We always will go to the brightest part of the image, the sharpest part of the image, whatever has more visual weight. So I'm creating color contrast. I'm creating luminosity contrast. Does everyone recognize this? Who here was in the Soho photo walk earlier this week? Okay, you guys fail. This is literally the hotel that we met at, and everyone stood right underneath this lamp. Right? It's everywhere, but if you see this on the back of your camera, you don't necessarily think you can create an image that has this kind of drama. And it doesn't have to be this dramatic either. But just know it's possible, and you don't need complicated tools to do it. Right, just changing a little bit of a color. Question in the back? Question is, are these in Lightroom Mobile?
Yeah, the enhancements, are you doing that on your phone?
Ah, are the enhancements made in Lightroom Mobile? The answer is it doesn't matter. Because Lightroom Mobile, almost at this point, June 2019, if I'm correct, we almost have full feature parity, meaning that I can start the adjustments in Lightroom Mobile, and I can finish them on my desktop and vice versa. It's a two-way, it's a fully interactive two-way sync. So the adjustments made on one will affect the other. So often I'll start it on my phone. It's nice to work on a bigger screen when you have a chance, but then again, at this point, it's just whatever I have available. It doesn't make much of a difference. If you start with Lightroom Mobile, then that's the workflow that I would, especially if I'm shooting my iPhone now. I would start editing, and then I would tweak it further when I have access to Photoshop. I'm sorry, Lightroom desktop version. All right, something like this, just very subtle. And now this is one of the images that I'll show you as well. All right, so let's move on a little bit. But I want to show you, just giving an idea of what we can do, right? And to answer that lady's question that emailed me the other day, the real answer is it's not Lightroom or Photoshop. That's an unnecessary question. It's Lightroom and Photoshop. But the real answer is going to be, when do we need to take this to Photoshop, right? The answer to that question is really when you can't do it in Lightroom. And that's the point of this class today, is to show you what we can do, so then you can make that decision when you hit the limits of Lightroom. And the reason why I said that there is a lot of overlap, you can adjust color, exposure, saturation, all of that inside of both programs. But Lightroom's always going to be the better program where there is overlap. Does anyone know why? Yeah, but the answer is non-destructive workflow. That's exactly true. Lightroom uses math where Photoshop uses pixels. So Lightroom's accessing all of the information available to you in the raw file. And it's just using math, a little bit of code to push that information. So you're not losing information, you're not compressing anything. And it's a completely non-destructive, non-linear workflow also, which means you can adjust anything at any order, anytime. Photoshop, it's very, very different. It's not a bad thing, but where there is overlap, you want to start in Lightroom. The second you send it to Photoshop, unless you have a very, very specific workflow, which I teach, that uses smart objects, you sever that non-linear, non-destructive relationship, because you have to export an actual pixel-based image to send to Photoshop. And when you import that back, you can't undo the adjustments that you made on the previous image. All right, so let's get started with a couple of these. This is just the raw file as it shows up. I'm just starting with this because this was the image that we used to promote this on B&H's event space, so hopefully this looks familiar. Everyone guess where this is? No? Floating Village, Cambodia, right outside of Siem Reap. The Tonle Sap. All right, so I always start with looking at the histogram. Right, this is how I understand the exposure. In digital photography, you want to get the brightest possible picture, but no brighter, meaning that you want all the information. Light is literally information in a picture, right? That's digital photography. We're capturing light. The more light, the more information. Your brighter files will actually have larger file sizes. You want the brightest possible image, but no brighter. And how I do is I look at this histogram, right? And I want actually, it should look like that. Right there, if we're looking at the upper right-hand side. Can you see that? Right? That's the right histogram. Every time, right? You want the brightest possible picture. That means that I can come back, even if it doesn't look perfect at all on the back of my camera, you need to get to the point where you can understand the potential of an image before you process it. And we're getting to a point now where it's going to be less and less of an issue. There's something called the feedback loop. Right? And if anyone shot film photography, they know exactly what I'm talking about. You take a picture, and then you send it out, and you wait a week to see if you got anything. That's incredibly inconvenient when you're in Cambodia and you're staring at a beautiful sunset. Right? So then with digital photography, where we can look at the back of the camera and get instant results. The next level is we have previews while we're taking pictures. And that's the stage we're getting into now, where we can preview the results of an image. The iPhones and the Android phones, I believe, as well. You can do this already. You can get black and white previews. You can get certain kind of effects. Once we get to a point in Lightroom, through Lightroom mobile app, that we can preview the presets that we have, it's going to change a lot of things. It'll help you better understand the potential. Until we get there, though, you need to see enough before and afters and understand how to process it so you can make the right decisions in the field. So the first, there was a question in the back. Yes?
Besides not obviously being everything one-sided on the histogram, what were the guidelines that you would use to say, this is bright enough, but not brighter? What would say you shouldn't go anymore to be not brighter?
Yeah, so the question is about the histogram. How do you know what's the right, when it's too bright, right? So let me just give you a really kind of rough, let me give you the cliff notes of the histogram. The only thing that matters is this right-hand side panel. This little bar right here. That's pure whites. All the histogram does is measure your blacks to your whites. That's all it does. And this is a range of tones. It doesn't matter the shape at all. It just doesn't matter, right? If I'm taking a picture of a black cat in front of a black wall, it's going to be a big bell curve over here. And if I take a picture of a white bride next to a white wall, it's going to be over here. The shape doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is a right-hand side. It's not climbing up that right-hand side wall. That's where you start to get highlights blown out, right? The left-hand side, it's important, but it's not as important as blowing it out.
Too high in the middle of the histogram?
The middle of the histogram is not relevant. It's only the pure blacks and the pure whites.
Okay.
And so if you see these little triangles here, this will even give me some warning. So if I overexpose this image and I click on this triangle, you'll see these little blinkies. You'll get this on the back of your camera too if you have the settings adjusted. I turn it off because it tends to drive me crazy. But all you have to know, even if it's slightly blown out, if you have a raw file, you'll be able to capture it. Right? It's a little bit more of an advanced technique, but you understand that this is based upon the information of a JPEG, not a raw file. And we have more information to recover our files from in a raw file. All right, so how would I start with this image?
Are you saying that there has to be some space between the peak of the histogram and the...
Yeah, so what I'm saying is you don't want the histogram climbing up the right-hand side like this. It should look like that. See that? The second that starts climbing up the right-hand side, you're starting to blow out your picture. When that happens, I won't be able to take my highlight slider and bring this back down. Do you see that? Just that one click? If I double click on this little nodule here, it'll just zero it back out. So all I'm doing is recovering my highlights. And while I'm at it, I can come over here and bring up my shadows. This is what we call normalizing the picture. I'm just bringing some of that detail back. Right? That's basic, right? That's pretty basic stuff because we're in our basic panel. But then,
You're talking about the height, not how far you are.
correct, the height. So we want to do a little bit more advanced things. How do we actually make an image look better? Right? So if the subject is this guy over here, and also a secondary subject of what's in my foreground, I want to add a little bit more drama to this, right? One of the ways I can do this is I can start with my Dehaze tool. And you see that kind of, it just brings everything out. If I go the opposite, we can get a little bit more of a hazy look, obviously. Maybe they just call that the haze tool. But we can go both ways. And now I have a little bit more detail. It does add a little bit more contrast, so I can come back to my shadows and bring it up. All right, so just that alone, I'm going to hit the backslash key. That's just my before and after. So I'm already starting to get a lot more color and detail out of this. Let's do something, let's spice it up a little bit. First of all, this is a little distracting in the corners. Someone told me a while ago, when you have triangles in the corners, it can get a little distracting, right? So let's get rid of it. Because when I get rid of an object, a lot of people don't know we can do this in Lightroom. We have our dust removal tool here. And it was intended to remove dust, but then they realized, well, we want to remove a lot more than dust sometimes. So I just come in here, and I can just drag that top left corner, and it just disappears. If I hit the H key for hide, it's going to show me. What it's doing is just picking another part of the image and it's replacing it, right? So now I have that, and if you can see this is my little light switch.
Which part it picks up?
I can choose the part it can pick up, yes. And so I can click this little light switch here, and I can turn that on off just to show you the adjustment. So now I'm cleaning up a little bit. Let's add a little bit more flavor to it. We have these other tools here, right? So everything in this right-hand panel are what we call global adjustments for the most part, other than HSL. It's kind of like a middle of the road. But most adjustments you need are just in this basic panel. But then we have, and the reason why we call this advanced photography, because I want to show you a little bit more about these tools. I never really get a chance to talk about this because we don't have a lot of time. So I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. So let's kind of bring things out a little bit. If I click on this is our gradient tool. And traditional landscape photographers are just going to use that to darken down the sky, like a 2 or 3 stop graduated neutral density filter. But what's cool about doing this in Lightroom is we can do not just, we can darken things down a little bit, but we have all these other adjustments over here that we can do. It's not just darkening it down. So for instance, I can just create more color, more saturation, like a bluer, cooler tone on the right. And then conversely, I come over here. And this is what I mean by non-destructive. I can adjust the sliders at any point. It doesn't make a difference. And I can kind of warm this up over here. All right, maybe just a little bit more magenta. Now, if I want to hide this, because it's a little distracting to see this bar, right? What keyword would I use to hide it? H. So it's just going to make it go away. It's not going to turn it off. It's just going to make it go away. It's just going to hide it. And now if I hit this little light switch, you can see there's like a subtle shift in the mood of the image. Right? So I'm just playing with light. I'm just kind of tweaking it a little bit because we've already covered the highlights. We brought up the shadow detail. All this is doing is turning on and off the effect of the image. What I also do, because this is a sunset shot, is split toning was designed to use on black and white images, right? And like everything else Adobe does, they think it's supposed to be designed one way, and photographers find another way of doing it. So that's what I do. I use this magical number 39. I don't know why, it just works. And I just bring the saturation up. And you can see how it just gives a little bit of a warm glow to it. Right? This is the before, that's the after. Can you see that? And I'll do the true before, that's a true after. Right? That's pretty much all we need to do. But we can take it further too while we're at it. But for the most part, you don't have to be looking for ways to adjust the image. It's pretty much all you need to do. But my idea is to give you some inspiration, also show you how the tools work a little bit. Yes?
It's not big enough to see from here. So before you say we're going to put in 39, could you please say in advance which slider you work?
Sure. If you guys can't see the sliders or adjustments, let me know. I'll just zoom in. So I put that in the hue of just the highlights slider,
You use that
39.
for sunset.
I use this to give a little bit of a warm glow. You see the difference?
Yeah.
It works really well on sunset. It works in other applications too, but it just really works for sunset or sunrise images. Anywhere you want a little bit of a warmth.
Was it 39?
39, almost every time. It's weird. I feel like I should patent that, or, you know, is it Michael Jordan that has 32, right? I should have 39. There you go. I'll sell a preset call, and it'll just be this one adjustment. All right, so let's move on a little bit. This is a little distracting here on the right-hand side, right? I have a couple options. One way I can do it is I can crop, right? That's the easiest way to remove a distraction. This is one of the things where getting it right in the field is actually helpful. If I would have been able to stand back, I can tell you right now, I was precariously balanced on a little dock. There's no way I was able to stand back. I would have been floating. So what I can do is hit R for the crop tool. This is the icon right here. And when I crop, a couple things. One, typically you want to choose a crop ratio and standardize that. If not, it throws people off when you show them a collection of images. Not every time, but you'll see this little lock icon. If I click that, now I can crop it to anything I want to, right? Another thing that's really helpful is if I hit the X key, it's going to switch between landscape and portrait. I don't know why it kind of resizes it there, because that's the equivalent of portrait. You can just click the reset button and it'll go back. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to lock that in place. And also a really, really handy tip is L for lights out. What that's going to do is just darken down the panel. Right, you'll see it on the right, but when it gets helpful is if I really want to crop out this right-hand side here, right, I'm still seeing, it's very distracting. So if I hit L for lights out twice, now I can crop and see exactly where I want it. Does that make sense? So I always kind of crop in this lights out mode. That's really handy.
Do those commands work both on PCs as well as Macs?
So I'm on a Mac right now. That's a good question. Does it work on both? Yes. Every time I hit Command, think Control on a PC. And every time I say Option, think Alt. And then you're in good shape. I can't say it all the time. It would drive me crazy. I would get very distracted too. Okay, so another way that I can remove this distraction is I can go to my gradient tool, this little icon right here, and I can just drag this to the right. Let me just preload this so I can show you what I'm doing. Right, when I drag this kind of gradient out, the less I drag, the harder the gradient is. It's like a hard stop. And the more I drag, the smoother it is. Right? So, and again, you can drag and then make your adjustments, or make your adjustments and then drag. Either way, because it's completely nonlinear, non-destructive. So I'm going to drag this out a little bit more, but I only want to affect this area here. I just want to darken it down. I don't need the detail in here. But what's happening is, as I do this, it's darkening down the sky as well, and I only want it to affect this area. So how can I target that adjustment to just this area? The answer is you start by pulling it on the upper right corner. That's not necessarily the best way to do it, because it's still going to darken the sky. Right? I can come in here and I can move this. I can come over here. It's still going to darken the sky. I only want to darken the objects. Nope. So here's how I can do it. I just need to cover, basically cover the area. That's all I really need to do. There's two ways, actually. One, I can paint it. That's going to take too long. I can use a paintbrush. What I want to do instead is we have this new feature called a range mask. And I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's relatively new. It's basically luminosity masking, but we could also mask by color. If I click on that, I have the option to either do color or luminance. And if you look carefully, we're not going to demo this today, but depth is grayed out. That's coming. Do you guys know what that means? Depth mapping. That happens when you have two lenses. What cameras have two lenses? Your iPhones, right? The portrait mode. So soon we'll be able to make adjustments based upon the depth map, the embedded depth map in the HEIC files from the iPhones, which is really cool. We can actually, this is already enabled. We can do that. We can do that now. Okay, so here's what I would do. I would say luminance. Now I'm going to make adjustment just based because this is dark. The sky is bright. This is dark. Right? And you'll see this over and over again. I'm going to come in here, and then I have, when I click luminance, I have my range and I have smoothness. And show luminance mask will basically show me my mask. That's what I'm doing right now, but that is affecting the sky. I'm going to bring this out a little bit more. And what I'm going to do is, just like my histogram above, I have my range from pure black to pure white. And that slider means if I pull from the left, I'm going to be removing all of the darks. That's the opposite of what do I want to do. Often I just don't even think about it. I'll just try one way, it doesn't work, try the other way. So here if I take my whites, my brights, and I start removing it from the adjustment, you'll see it's kind of targeting just the darks. And that's how I make my selection. But it's also helpful if I hold the control key. Sorry, the option key on a Mac. It'll give me a live mask is what we call it. So everything that's white is being affected, everything that's black is being removed. So we no longer have to sit there and paint with our brush to get all the edges. This is a much more advanced feature. This is a much better way of approaching it. It's a lot quicker too. So now I know when I make my adjustments, I'm gonna hit O for overlay. I can come in here and I can just affect that. So I'm just gonna darken that down a little bit. Does that make sense? Okay, enough of that image. Let's look at another image. But that's how we get to, that's a before, that's a after. Right, and once you do this long enough, you'll start to realize in the field, you can kind of pre-visualize this. That's the before picture. Right, I'm about, I don't even know how many miles away, quite a far distance, drive up this mountain. Because I saw the shot once where, and I couldn't see it when I was staying at, this is the Banff Hotel. And I couldn't see it at the time, but it's so perfectly situated in Banff. It's a very historic hotel. It's beautiful, the property. But I wanted to compress it and show it inside that landscape. So this is what I got, right? So first of all, if we're looking at the histogram again, let's examine this. I don't have any pure blacks. I don't have any pure whites. That's why everything kind of looks gray, right? All I kind of need to do is I can take my whites and I can just move it to the right until it starts touching the right. Take my blacks, move it to the left, and just that alone. That's my before, that's my after. We're just adding that contrast back. We're mapping our tones from black to white. But I want to add a little bit more warmth to this. I want to make things stand out. Because what's the brightest part of the image right now? Right? It's the boring sky. And that's not what interests me about this. Your eye will always go to the brightest part of the image. So how do we darken that? Well, for starters, I can take the highlights and I can bring this down. But I want to darken the top part of the image. So what tool would I use to darken just the top part of the image, right? Because if I can adjust the brightness of the whole image, that doesn't really help me much. Right? I would use the gradient tool right up here. And I come over here and drag. Now, have you guys ever had trouble just with this? Drives me freaking crazy. If you hold the shift key down, it will give you a perfectly straight line. It just makes life a lot easier. And that goes in both ways, both directions. So I'm just going to drag a gradient down. And if I really want this to pop, one way I can use is the Dehaze tool. So I'll bring the whites down, and I'll just use the Dehaze tool. You'll see it brings all that detail back. But it's a little blue, so I'll probably warm this up a little bit. When I warm it up, we're getting this kind of like green cast. So I could just offset that. What's nice is you can actually see the colors on the sliders, the temperature and the tint sliders. So if I want to offset the green, I just drag in the opposite direction and I add a little magenta. And maybe I'll just for effect, I'll give a little bit more dehaze. All right, now let's do the same thing from the bottom. I want to preserve this kind of white cloud layer. So I'll drag up from the bottom, and the more I drag, the smoother that gradient is. And I can kind of dehaze as well. I can add some more clarity. All right, that's good enough for now. What else can I do? How about the magic 39? Split toning. It's a sunset. 39, add some more warmth to the image. Right, that's the before, that's the after, just that one slider. Now it's really starting to take effect. That's the before, that's the after. Right, if I click on here, that's the after. I'm just dragging that one slider down. This is really what I want to focus on now. So if I darken down the whole image just a little bit, that's a global adjustment. I want to target just this hotel. I want to make my subject the brightest part of the image. Right? So how am I going to target this hotel? There's two ways I can target this hotel. I can either brush or I can use another target adjustment, which we haven't talked about yet. That's this guy, your radial filter. If you hover over this and just let go, if you have a little patience, it will tell you the name of the tool, which is helpful for me because I sometimes forget, I just do it, right? But Shift M is a shortcut. M is for the gradient, Shift M is for the radial tool. The reason why we want to use a radial tool, not the gradient, is I just want to select a region. So now I can select this region, and I want to make it bright. So let's brighten it. But what's happening? It's affecting everything inside that, right? This is where we were stuck up until a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, something like that. We have a range mask tool. We do have another option too. We have a brush tool up here. And if I click on that, I can come down to my erase. I want to make sure auto mask is on so it'll detect the edges. Then come in here, probably add a little bit of a gradient. And I can kind of paint. This is the old school way of doing it, but I can paint away the effect. But you'll see it's not perfect. So I'm going to undo that, Command Z to undo that. Instead, all I really need to do, range mask, luminance, and just remove it. Just remove the effect from the darks. Now I can come in here and I can brighten it more. I can add a little texture, really make it stand out. Maybe give a little bit of that warm glow. And that's just that one effect here. So this is the power of a little bit more advanced post-processing. It's not just using the basic sliders. We're making target adjustments. And typically the way you want to do it is you want to work globally first. Bring back the highlight detail, bring back the shadow detail, remove any distractions, anything like that. You could even crop because the crop itself is even non-destructive. But you do want to get into, when it makes sense, you don't have to do it for every image, you want to get into making target adjustments. That's really where this starts to shine. So again, these are distractions too, right? We want to minimize all distractions. We want to make it so obvious that this is a subject and remove everything else. It's like a solo in a song, right? Everything else needs to shut up so you can really understand that one instrument, that one vocal. And so we want to just keep it that way. So how do I do that? Just darken or brighten. I can come in here. If I want to select this area, I'm just going to drag my gradient tool, hit H to hide it, and I can just kind of darken that. Maybe bring the highlights down a little bit more. And I can kind of mask that by just adding a larger gradient. That's all. Maybe we just warm it up a little bit. And that's all we need to do. I'd probably also add a little bit of vignette. Why do we add a vignette? Because it keeps your eyes in the middle of the frame. which is both good and bad. We don't have any options as far as where we place a vignette, right? And our subject isn't always in the center of the frame. More often than not, it shouldn't be in the center of a frame. So if that's the case, right, and if a vignette doesn't work, and that's the power of vignette. If you really want to see, you can change the feather. I'll turn that off. And this will help you understand the midpoint, that we can adjust the size of it, and we can adjust the shape of it. But we can't adjust the location of it, which is really frustrating, right? Because my subject's all the way down here, so that doesn't really help me much. So I'm going to double click this to zero it out. Right? Anytime I double click the slider, it's going to zero it out. Now I'm going to create my own vignette in another way. How would I create a vignette that I can move? The radial filter tool, right? Now I can create just the same thing as that vignette that I had before. So now I can kind of move it wherever I want to. And then I can darken it. And this is going to happen to you all the time. Don't freak out. It's always going to darken the middle first. Or depending on your computer, I don't even know at this point, it might always darken the other way. The bottom line is 90% of the time it's not going to do what you want it to do. Right? That just seems to be the way it works out. So it's this little icon right here, invert. If I click that, it will just reverse it. So now I do have, I can move this around anywhere I want to, right? So it is sort of a nice vignette, but what's cool is it's not just a vignette that I have now. So I can move this down. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. I can make it as large as I want to. I'm obviously going to not make it too dark. But we have options of all these other tools that a vignette doesn't offer us. So if I wanted to, I can add a little bit more of a dehaze. I can add some negative clarity to kind of soften things, because our eyes will always go to the sharpest part of the image first. The brightest part, the sharpest part, whatever's in focus versus out of focus. So we could even take the sharpness and bring it down. And you can see it's just going to get a little bit softer in the background, and it really makes a subject, what I think is a subject is this mountain, this lodge in the landscape, kind of stand out. We could also create more color contrast. We can make that a little bit warmer. We can make that a little bit cooler. So we have full creative control rather than just a standard vignette. It's a vignette we can move around, but also make all these other adjustments. Yes, there's a question.
You said the either or was going on which adjustment, which slider, which piece, what were you changing when you were saying? Either the brightest or the sharpest?
The question is what adjustments I was making. You can make any adjustments you want if you use a selective adjustment tool. The adjustment I was making to make it softer, there's a couple ways you can de-emphasize a subject, right? You can make it darker. You can make it bluer. You can change the color temperature. But you also have access to texture, clarity, and dehaze, and sharpness. All of these are going to soften the background, right? So if I take the texture, you'll see that. If I take the clarity down and I take the sharpness down, now we're really adjusting the sharpness. Does that make sense? All right.
I just wanted to know which part here the either or was reflecting on.
I don't understand the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if you have.
Clarity, you said either or.
Mhm.
I didn't know what that was qualifying. That statement was
I think you were saying that the eye goes first to the brightest.
The eyes will always go to the brightest and sharpest part of the image. Yeah, yeah. Think about it. I mean, everywhere you go, especially in New York, we're inundated with information. Everywhere. We take in massive amounts of information every second. We're really good. You know, some friends of mine might even say I'm a little too good at throwing away all that information, right? So we're instantly processing things and removing everything that, even in the background, we don't even understand that we're doing it. Anything that doesn't make sense, anything that doesn't even apply. So even when it applies when we look at an image, we're always going to go to, for this, for instance, we're always going to go to the face. If there's a person in the scene, we're going to go to the person. If there's a face, we're going to go to the face. If you can see their eyes, we're going to go to the eyes, right? But anything that's not in focus, anything that's too dark where there's no detail, we're just going to discard it. And we can use that to an advantage. So we started getting into HDR imagery, for instance. It was great because we bring all the detail, but we don't need all the shadow detail. If there's not relevant information in the shadows, it's a really good creative tool to let it go into silhouette, to let it go dark, right? So we can affect that if we, as long as we understand how the human mind views and interprets images. That's a really powerful tool. I call it a visual roadmap. I've done one presentation on that previously as well. So that would guide every decision. This is what I talk about in my Lightroom mastery class this coming weekend, on the 6th and the 7th. But basically, it'll guide every decision you make on how you process an image. So if I look at this image, for instance, this is an organization called Big Life I was working with out in Kenya. These are local farmers, essentially, that are protecting the land from poachers, the large herd elephants from poachers. And to my mind, they're heroes. They're really on the front lines, but they're just protecting their families, really. So I wanted to show them as heroes. And so I brought one light with me, and I had them kind of backlit by the sun. I had a strobe lit off to the side. But what's the brightest part of the image? It's the sun. It's always going to be the sun a little bit. We can certainly de-emphasize it, but I want to draw the eye to his face and that look, right? You don't quite know what that is. Is that hesitance? Is that confidence? So how would I do that? Well, I would take the highlights and I could just bring the highlights back. That alone does a really good job. Then I can take the shadow details. I always start with my global adjustments, and I can kind of bring that. That's going to be a little bit too much. Again, we don't need, someone told me a long time ago, if you want to make things look interesting, don't light all of it, right? You want to have something fall into shadow. And if you're going to have light, shadow, light, shadow, light, shadow, it really creates these layers and drama in an image. So we have light, shadow, light, shadow, light, shadow. And so now I want to, now just that alone, right, makes a big difference. But I really want to emphasize some more. So how would I do that? Well, first of all, when you're using a light, especially in a limited circumstance like this, where I had one person holding it because the umbrella stand broke, it's lighting the foreground. I don't need that foreground lit. So what would I do? I'm going to take my gradient tool, hold the shift key down so it's straight, and I'll just drag it up. It's not going to do what I want it to do just by default. It never does. But then I can come here and I can darken things down a little bit, right? I'm removing the possibility of my eye going to a bright part of the image, which doesn't necessarily occur to people. When I was first learning this, I'd see these instructors making all these adjustments, and they would never really explain why. I'm just going to darken this, going to brighten this. Well, why? Because it would never occur to me to brighten his or darken down by his feet. But when you see the before and after, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? You want your eye to go where you want the eye to go, whatever your subject is. That's why you took the picture in the first place. So how do I make the eye more about him again? Well, that was one tool. I can darken down the distractions. I remove the brightness of the sun. Let's target him more. What tool can I use to target him more? Radial filter tool. This, I think, is the most powerful tool. So select him. Now I have two options. I could either brighten him or I can darken the background. It kind of doesn't make a difference. So let's darken the background. I already know this isn't going to work, right? But I just want to explain it to you. I can just reverse it. I can brighten him. That's fine. Or I can invert it and darken the background. But then the whole image starts to look dark, right? But that's fine, because I have a selective adjustment, and then I have the exposure. I can make a global adjustment back up again. So I can warm the entire picture up, and I can go back to my selective adjustment and cool just the background, right? Because I have two different regions now that I'm creating of light. Is that making sense a little bit? The global adjustment will only give me that one global, one region adjustment, and I want to create layers. I want to channel the light. I want to push the light where my subject is. So now, just with that one tool, I'm kind of really channeling the light a little bit more. I still want to channel the light a little bit more. So what's cool about this filter is that, unlike the Vignette tool, we can use it more than once. Click it again. I can draw a little circle right on him. Just on his face. And now I can just add a little bit of sharpness and just a touch of brightness. Actually, what I typically do is, I usually don't teach these in my classes as much until it's like one of the advanced courses, is if I hover over any of these adjustment sliders here, I can use the up and right arrow key. And you'll see, let me zoom in a little bit. It makes the adjustments in discrete increments, right? Which doesn't occur to you at first. But when you're trying to adjust an image, and you're adjusting a slider, where are you looking? You're looking at the slider, right? That's not where you should be looking. You should be looking at where the adjustment is. So what this will do is you kind of hover over where you need to make the adjustment, and then you just look at the image. And then I can just hit the plus and minus key.
To enter that, I just discovered actually you have a mouse with a wheel on it that will also do that.
Mhm.
So you can stare
That's
at
correct. You can also apply this to a mouse with a wheel. I haven't used those in, I think, in like 10 years, but you certainly can. You can hover over and you can apply it, so you can just make those discrete adjustments. What's nice is if you hold the shift key down, you can make larger adjustments. Right? And then you let go of the shift key and you can tweak it. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because you should be looking at the image, not the slider. And if you're like me, you're working on a smaller screen. My laptop is my main computer now because of the travel that I'm doing. It's just too bulky otherwise. So that screen real estate is really important. So I really make this as small as possible. One trick is that you can just drag this panel to the left. And now you actually have a little bit. It's not going to be as sensitive because you have more room. So if you have a large monitor, that's definitely one way you can do it, because the sliders can be very sensitive. I usually make it all the way to the right because it gives me more screen real estate, which means that I definitely need to hover and then just use this up and down arrow keys. Right? It just gives you very discrete results. That's pretty much all I would need to do for this image. Maybe one thing more, since I'll just drill this into you guys. I will do some split toning. All right, and just kind of add a little bit more punch to this, just a little bit more warmth. That's our before, that's our after, right? Doesn't have to be anything more than that. If we wanted to sharpen this, because I just had someone reach out to me this morning about sharpening. This is already pretty sharp, but when you sharpen, you do want to sharpen in 1:1 mode, or at least zoom in. So right now you'll see that I'm in a 1:1 mode. All I really do is click once and it'll zoom back out. But this is how you'll actually see the sharpening. And what's good to know is, the reason why this kind of came about is someone reached out recently and they said, well, I have a JPEG and I have a RAW file. My JPEGs look sharper. And that's correct. Your JPEGs are sharper because JPEGs are cooking in sharpening already, where your RAW files aren't. And this went on and on to the point where Adobe was tired of fielding questions about this, because your RAW files are giving you the opportunity to sharpen creatively, is that now they just give you a default sharpening. Is that 40 now? It used to be at 20. They might have increased it. But basically the default sharpening will get you back to where the capture sharpening stage is from JPEGs, right? Especially on the older cameras, almost all the Canon cameras still have an anti-aliasing filter, which intentionally blurs the picture a little bit. So this will bring back that sharpening. When I sharpen though, what I'll do is, that's how I sharpen. I just go out around 100 and I'll drag my masking tool. And this is important. And I'll just mask this. Can you guys see this? No, of course you can. I can't see it either. That's why they give us the masking tool. And if I hold Option down, then I can see what I'm doing. And when you sharpen, you only really want to sharpen the edges. Right? And I'm using the term sharpen loosely because we're not technically making an image sharper. There's only one way you can do that. You can go downstairs and you can buy better glass from B&H. Right? But it's the illusion of sharpening. What that means is it's taking the edges where brightness and shadow meet and it's exaggerating it. It's making the bright brighter, the dark darker. Right? And it's doing it right at the edges. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure that it only focuses the sharpening on the edges. If I zoom out, you'll see what I mean. I don't need to sharpen the sky. Right, there's no detail in there. I don't want to sharpen the edges. This is really handy, especially when you're shooting portraits, especially when you're shooting portraits of women. Right? They don't want all the detail, all the texture on their skin. So you can just focus the sharpening right to the edges.
And the other two sliders in the sharpening?
The other two sliders, forget about them. Right? I'm here to simplify this for you. Honestly, the amount and the masking is pretty much all you need. What the radius is going to do is going to look at that edge that I told you about, which is where the brightness and the shadow meet. And it's just going to, well, if I click on this little icon here, I'll show you. And it's just going to take that sharpening effect, that contrast at the edge, and it's going to expand it further from that edge. That's all it's going to do. Honestly, I rarely use this. And detail, the same thing. It's just going to give you a little bit more micro contrast in the areas around that edge. I don't use either of those. It's just the amount and the masking. There's also, while we're on the subject of sharpening, actually, you know what? Let's go into another image where we can talk about textures. And the reason, this is a nonlinear editing, but I'm also nonlinear. So I just kind of go, because the whole idea is to show you my process. I never really get an opportunity to really go into actually how I sit down and edit. I just show people before and afters, and that's great. But let's really get into it. So what would I do with this image? Right? What's the brightest part of the image? What's my subject? So how do I fix that? I can start globally, which means I come down and I take the highlights, and I can recover the highlights. How do I know I can do that? I'm looking at the histogram. It's still just a touch too bright, but I know that that histogram is also based on the back of the camera. It's on a JPEG image. I have a little bit more flexibility, especially with the Sony sensors, the newer Sony sensors. You have an incredible range. So I can just retain that highlight detail without a problem. But what if I want that sky to be a little bit darker, right? I already took my highlight slider and I brought it down as much as possible. I still want that sky to be a little bit darker. You'd think dehaze, right? But that's going to adjust the whole thing, right? And it's going to change the contrast of the image. What I do is just take the exposure slider and just until that sky looks good to me. Everything else gets dark too, but that's fine because that's why we have our shadow slider, where I can bring it all back up again. Right, so just that alone, and you'll notice the histogram now, that's the before where everything is either almost pure white or really close to the blacks. And now I'm kind of evening everything out a little bit, but I'm also making sure I have a white and a black point. So it's not just muddy, and I'm expanding the range of the tones. So just that alone, that's before and after. But this is an advanced course. I want to show you how we can take it even further. So once I determine what my subject is, what tool can I use to select the subject? Right, the radial filter tool. Come over here. Select this gang over here. And the dehaze is probably a good place to start. Again, it's going to be the opposite, so I'll invert it. And just that alone, if I double click, it'll zero it out. But I want to add maybe just a little bit of warmth to it. And that's great, but they still look a little dark, right? I darken the background, but I want to make them brighter. Well, what we can do, rather than just adding another filter, I can right-click and I can duplicate this. That kind of looks cool, but it's not what I wanted, right? It's a happy mistake. But I can invert this. So now I'm selecting the inside of it. If I double, see, I have these sliders kind of set up already, and I can certainly just zero these out. But a quick way to do it, if you have a lot of sliders in play, is just double click this word effect, and it will just zero everything out for you. And now I can come in here and I can just bring them up, which looks great, but you'll realize if I say O for overlay, it's not just affecting them, it's also affecting the sky, right? If I chose color as a range mask tool, that wouldn't work because of all these different colors. I could come over here and I could judge my luminance, and I can start reducing the effect that way. But it's also going to affect that boat because it's the same brightness value, right? So that doesn't always work all the time. What I would do instead is I'm going to hit O for overlay. That's going to show me a mask overlay. Take my brush tool, go to erase, make sure auto mask is on. I usually turn my feather up almost all the way. And I can just start masking away. Let me zoom in a little bit more. I'm just kind of masking away. So now it's only affecting them. That's it. Hit O. Now I can make them as bright and add a little bit of contrast, add a little sharpness, texture, clarity, and zoom back out. To kind of finalize this, I would go to my effects, I would add just a little bit of vignette. Very subtle, increase the feather. I probably would warm it up just a little bit too, with that little split toning trick because it's later in the afternoon. And then tone curve, this is another tool I use. If I just want to add like a little bit of punch to an image, people talk about punch all the time, almost like when you turn the brightness up of your monitor and everything just looks punchier, brighter, more contrasty. I always work at the maximum brightness. That's why I carry a battery charger with me everywhere on my phone, because it's always at 100% brightness. I don't understand why anyone does anything else. So all I do is, this is how I use the tone curve. I just go to the lights and I go halfway. I don't adjust anything else. And all it does, it almost gives you the effect of turning the lights on. Right? And if that's too much because we have that, now it starts to look a little blown out in the sky. Well, how would I adjust that? Right? It's a little bit of a dance, it's a give and take. I can go back to my highlight slider and I can bring the highlights back down again. Except my highlight slider is already maxed out. So how would I do this further? How do I recover the highlights when I've already recovered all of my highlights? Shift M, select that region, and just bring the highlights back down again. And you can even bring the exposure back down. If you don't like what it did with the shadows, I don't have a problem with it. But if you really wanted to affect just the highlight part of that sky that I selected, come over to Range Mask, go to Luminance, and I can remove all the shadows from that adjustment so it's only affecting the highlights. That's my before, that's what I see in the back of the camera. That's my after. That's the potential I'm seeing while I'm looking at what I'm seeing in the back of the camera. The quicker you get there, the quicker you make that bridge, the more it's going to inform your photography. Does this make sense? Okay, let's move on.
You shoot with quite a depth of field. If you want to narrow that, can you do that in post? Like,
Question is depth of field. Can I narrow the depth of field?
put focal in the back?
It's a one-way street. If I capture all of the depth of field, if everything's sharp from front to back, I can isolate. If I did that with this, I would select my subject. I can come in here, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, and I would take the sharpness and I would bring it down. It's subtle, you don't see it much, right? I can also take the clarity and bring it down. I'll invert this. It doesn't give me the full range. Like, we don't have an out of focus tool yet in Lightroom. But what we do have is the ability to duplicate and resize so that you don't have that hard edge. You can also feather this off a little bit and then duplicate again. Now you should be able to see the effect. You see that? So we can reduce the sharpness, which is almost the effect of having a shallow depth of field, but it's only one-way street. If you have a shallow depth of field, if you're shooting with an 85, 1.2 or 1.4 and everything's out of focus except part of the face, for instance, is very popular for portraits, there isn't really a way to get that back. You can't bring things back into focus, right? But you can take things that are in focus and remove it or just soften it so it looks like it's out of focus.
You shoot with an Apple and you can do a lot of that.
Yes, so very interesting point. I do shoot with an iPhone a lot. It has a portrait mode. And what that is, it builds in a depth map and it uses parallax between two different lenses. And everything's in focus when you're shooting with the phone because it has a small sensor, right? Which traditionally was a problem. Now it's actually a really great asset because if everything's in focus, like I just said, then we have the ability to take it out of focus. Then we can play with the highlights, then we can play with anything we want to because we could build a depth map. Until the larger cameras have that capability, you're gonna have more creative control with focus with your cell phone, which is really interesting. And now that we have the depth map built in a Lightroom, it's not just focus, but you can select parts of the image based upon the depth, the Z-axis in the image, which is really, so I wouldn't even have to select the sky anymore. It'll just know that that's the furthest part of the image away, right? What's cool is, if anyone had taken a portrait with a shallow depth of field and it focused on the nose, right? This will happen, if you're shooting pets, this will happen every time, unless you have the new update from Sony, which will do animal eye autofocus. The newer camera will have eye autofocus because every time when you're shooting shallow depth of field, you want that eye and the near eye to be in focus. But the camera is trained to focus on whatever's closest, which is the nose, which is a problem. right? And you can't go back and fix that. So you have to be critical. You have to be really careful about getting that eye in focus. And if it's not, you're kind of SOL. But if you're shooting with an iPhone or you're shooting with a cell phone or something that has a depth map, you can retain that depth of field. You have everything in focus, and then later you can choose, right? It's the same effect as a tilt shift lens. Right? I don't understand why people use tilt shift lenses that much anymore. And they use it to throw the back and front out of focus. Well, we just do that here with our gradient tool with a lot more creative control. And it doesn't really cost us a lot of money because we use the lenses that we already have. The reason why those tilt shift lenses are actually handy because it changes the plane of focus. So it allows you to get everything in focus. That's the point, is to get everything in focus from front to back without having to stop down to F22. That's a whole different conversation. But just know that you have a lot more creative control with this, because it's not just the focus, but now we can adjust the highlights, shadows, color, temperature, texture, all of that.
How would you just lighten their faces a little?
How would we lighten the faces?
Faces, yeah, that
Well, let's do it. Let's find a face. Let's choose this guy. This is actually how the image turned out for several reasons. One is it was a long day. We were hiking for 15 miles in the desert. I think probably one of the adjustments were knocked or whatever. Here's the thing, it doesn't actually matter that much. If I hit I for information, I'm shooting at ISO 100. And a lot of people don't know this. I didn't realize this for years when I first started out. When you're at your base ISO, your lowest ISO, you have a lot more creative control, a lot more flexibility in post-processing, a lot more dynamic range that's captured. If this is ISO 16, I wouldn't be able to do this. Now look at the detail, right? That's pretty insane for that image. It's almost like you can't even see it, right? So yeah, I can brighten this, but to go back to the question, how do I brighten the face? Well, I would select the region of the face. I use that radial filter tool. Since I'm using what we call short lighting, we have highlights and shadows. His face is the brightest part of the image. There's a reason why I did that. You get it above the face, it creates this kind of jawline shadow, and then you have bright shadow, right? If you use broad lighting and I shot on the other side of him, it would just be one wall of flesh. And almost no circumstances of one wall of flesh a good thing, right? You want to shoot from the shadow side, the short side. And so now I can just come in here, I can kind of brighten this. And again, I can take my range mask tool, go to Luminance, and I can isolate it just to his face. Now if I wanted to, I can add more texture. Really bring out that texture. What I did when I actually post-processed these images, I just removed, it was kind of a look maybe 3 or 4 years ago, this kind of desaturated, hyper texture kind of look. And all they were doing is removing the vibrance, kind of like that, and adding clarity. They didn't have texture at the time. Texture is a brand new feature. And you'll see the difference. You see how clarity kind of adjusts? It messes with the contrast and the color as well, where texture doesn't. It just adds, but it's a different frequency. It's so very, very small lines is what texture is affecting. Just the very, very tiniest textures. Where clarity is kind of the medium lines, like the lines on the shirt versus the pores in the skin. And then Dehaze is going to give you the larger lines, which will drastically affect the contrast as well. So texture is a really cool slider. And that would be my before. That would be my after. Right? If I wanted to, I can, this might be a little distracting, so I come in here with my brush tool, which I haven't talked about too much. And I can just take maybe the highlights down, and I would just kind of brush over there. That's it. You see how it didn't, bless you, see how it didn't pick up? Because I had the auto mask on. And this is going to happen every now and again. So what you do is instead, you turn auto mask off, and it will just give you a very smooth line. Does that make sense? So oftentimes you'll want to mask the entire thing and just kind of paint away. To give you an example of that, let's see here. This is a good example. So I shot this a few weeks ago for SUNY Cortland's. We were photographing the entire campus, and that's the final shot. Right? This is the shot they were trying to get. This is what I was kind of encountering when I walked in there. And try lighting a pool, unless you're Cliff Hausner and you have access to 20 strobes, and he will do this. It's very interesting. Lightroom can be your friend here. So for instance, this pool, look at the color of the water here, and then look at the color here. Why would I choose this image by the way? It looks kind of dark, right? But look at the histogram, right? If I went any brighter, I wouldn't have any detail in the highlights. And since I had a tripod, I was able to shoot at ISO 50, which is my absolute lowest ISO, which means I have all the range in the world for my exposure. Right? It's one of the reasons why we use a tripod, otherwise I wouldn't bother. I can't stand using tripods, it's a necessary evil. All right, so what I would do is I would brighten this entire image. Then I would take the highlights and retain that highlight detail back. So it's a good start, right? It looks a little warm, so I'd probably cool this off a little bit. I don't need to do this all the time. Often I would just auto white balance. It does a pretty good job. Does anyone know what the shortcut is for white balance? White balance. Take a guess. W. Press on anything white. Press again. Press again. The reason we're getting kind of weird results is because you have mixed lighting. We have the interior lights and then we have the exterior daylight. Right? So it gets you maybe in a starting point, but I would definitely bring this back up a little bit. So I would start there, and I really want this to be very bright. But then I have that issue of the highlights again, right? So I have the shadow detail where I want. I'm bringing all that back, but now it starts to get kind of blown out a little bit. So I need to select these windows, because I already brought my highlights down. What's the best way to select the windows here? I'm just selecting the very brightest part of the image, right? Go to my gradient tool, drag it down. It's already affecting the windows. Now they look great, but it's affecting everything else too. It's always a constant dance back and forth. So I need to isolate it. Go to my Luminance, bring that range tool back. I'll put on that live mask to show you. I'm going to bring this only until we're isolating just the brightest part of the image. And if that's not even enough, we can adjust the smoothness and really kind of tweak this. Right? If you ever hear the term luminosity masking being thrown around in Photoshop circles, and this is the ultimate way, well, yeah, it is. It's the ultimate way of getting fine-tuned detail. But we have a version of that in Lightroom that gets the job done really well. So now I can come in here and I can adjust the windows the way I want to. Right? I don't need all that detail there, so I would probably, in fact, I think when I actually edited this, I just brought the texture down a little bit. I kind of let them blow out. So now we have this, that's our before, that's our after, starting to look better. But this pool, would you want to go swimming in that pool? All right? No, I wouldn't want, I want a nice, clean, bright pool, right? It needs to be inviting. So how am I going to make an adjustment of this? It's a very irregular shape, so that gradient tool isn't going to work because it's not on any one side of the image. The radial filter tool might work, but it's not really, we can try it, right? I can adjust this, I can grab it, I can bring this over here. Now I want to make it blue. There you go. Now that color is perfect. That looks excellent, doesn't it? No, it looks terrible because it's affecting everything else. So I can come in here and I can kind of just brush all this away. But actually what I typically do is, since this is an advanced course, I'll take my brush, I'll take the feather off entirely. And I'm going to darken this down just to show you what I'm doing. I'm going to turn auto mask off. And I'll add that color blue. I'll just kind of preload it. And I'm just going to paint. I don't need to darken this. I'll just add that color blue. And all I'm doing is kind of covering very, very loosely, like in kindergarten. Right? But the reason is it's giving me 100% opacity over the entire color of the water. Because all color is made up of, you know, different variations, the way the light's hitting it, especially with water. So auto mask won't work. But I'm not getting the lines perfect. I don't care. Because then I can come in here with the erase tool. I can turn off auto masking again. But then we have this really interesting feature that they did borrow from Photoshop. Let me just finish painting this entirely here. Go to my eraser tool. Turn the feather off. And all I would do is I need to make a perfect selection of the edge. I would click once, hold shift down, and click again. And it gives you a perfectly straight line. I'll do it on this side. Click once, line it up, hold shift down and click again. Now it gives me a perfectly straight line. So I'm making a pixel perfect accurate selection of the pool. I couldn't do that with a radial mask.
How does it know to stop?
So this is how I do it. I go to the rest. Let me just finish this. Come over here. Go to the rest. And you can kind of tweak it if you don't get it perfect. Because everything's non-destructive. So I can come in here
That's where the first.
and just give me a perfect selection.
That's where the first clip goes.
You click once where you want to start, and then hold shift down and click the second time. Right? If I didn't get this, that's fine. I just paint away.
That's just like a
But if you want to make a perfectly straight line, this is how you do it. So I'm not going to do this entirely, but I'll just give you an idea. This is why you get paid by the hour sometimes. Actually, if you get paid by the hour, you come in here and do it manually, pixel by pixel. All right? I was born at night, but not last night. All right, so let's assume that's a perfect selection now. I'll hit O to turn the overlay off. Now I can control that color of the pool. All right, maybe make it a little bit brighter, maybe make it a little bit more saturated. Now, is that a pool you want to swim in? Yeah, right, that's our before. That's our after. All right, we have this a little bit of vignetting around the side. This will happen. This was a 10 millimeter, so widest lens in the world. It's a 10 millimeter rectilinear lens. So you're going to get this natural vignetting. What I would do is come over here to lens corrections. And one click is going to remove most of that. Right, this will happen with most cameras and most lenses. Adobe's profiled the natural fall off is what they call of the lenses. So it's good. And in fact, if you wanted to, a nice little shortcut too to keep things efficient is you can come, let's say every image you look at, you want just a little bit of sharpness, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation, just a little bit of punch. You can just dial all those settings in, and over here where it says reset, if I hold the option key, it'll say set default. And I click that, and it's going to say, all right, from every picture from here on in, I'm just going to default to these settings. So if you like the auto lens correction and it's not on by default, you can turn it on, hold the option key down, Alt on a PC, set it for your PC guys, and click set default, and now it will always apply that lens correction. The other way you can do it is create a preset. Right? It would just turn everything off except for your lens correction. Right? So there's ways you can automate it. The reason when I did it, you see this ISO. Notice that it says ISO speed rating, right? Because I can adjust the noise reduction based on ISO, so I never have to touch that again. And for each level, so I don't even touch my noise reduction until I get to 3200, right? And then I could say apply 5%, and then default, and then apply 10% when it gets to 64, apply 15% when it gets to 12,000, whatever, right? So it's just something to keep, you can fully automate everything. Really handy feature to have. So if I wanted to brighten this even more, how would I do that? Right? It's still not this white, this perfectly kind of white. I want this to look pristine, like no one's ever been in this building before. I'm going to grab my gradient tool, drag it over, done. Now, I'm going to double click the word effect, and I'm going to remove the saturation, and I'm going to brighten up just the highlights a little bit. Maybe I would just brighten up the shadows as well, and just give it a little bit more punch, and then some clarity, some texture, and some contrast. There we go. Now if I only wanted to apply to the brightest parts, again, I would go to that Luminance Mask and drag the shadows up a little bit. But in fact, if I don't want those whites to blow, I could do the opposite as well. All right, it's very subtle, but it's giving me a lot more vibrancy in the image. Does that make sense? So we go from that to that. And this isn't something that you go into this knowing that you're going to capture it, that you need to do all these things. It's just once you understand the effects and how to use these tools, and I know I'm shooting at ISO 50, and I know I'm on the tripod, I'm locked down, I have all the focus that I need and the depth of field, I know I can play around with this after the fact.
Is there a way to make a preset for import if you're going to be, all your software?
The question is, can I make a preset for import? Well, yeah, I mean, you can make a preset for anything, and then, correct, and then I can apply that at the import stage. So if you like seeing only black and white images, you can say, all right, I like this image. I'll get to it, and then I'm just going to bring, let's just go to black and white. I'm going to add some clarity and texture and a vignette, and I really kind of like this look in general. I'm going to turn curve, bring this up. I can create a preset. I can label it black and white high contrast. And when I go to import my images, I can choose that preset to apply to every image before I even look at it. Right? So if you're shooting black and white images specifically, your best bet is to shoot color and then make adjustments after the fact. There's probably a good example in here for that. I'll see if I can find one. This would be a good example. And recognize this? I'm looking at you, the people that were in the Soho photo walk. Yeah, so you can, no, I might have disconnected that. Let's see if there's another one here that we can do. Here we go. So this is a black and white. And you can adjust the sky, just brought the detail down in the sky. That's all we did. I don't know why I just removed that file. But let's go back to this. So if I wanted to adjust this, right, and I wanted to take the color out, I could just remove that saturation and just bring that down. In fact, I could do that, and I have a black and white image, but I don't have much creative control. Right? Otherwise, I can come in here, and if I click on black and white, I don't know why they put it in two different places, it's weird, but you have to go down to this slider over here, black and white. And now you have full access to color. But how do you really know what color is what? Right? You can reset it. Now, let's say I want to darken down just this one color. Well, you kind of don't need to know what the underlying color is anymore. The important thing is that it's there, and you're shooting a raw color image. I have this little thing called a target adjustment tool, and if I hover over that, I can just choose individual colors. Right? And it's making tonal selections based upon the underlying color. So always want to shoot in color and then post-process using those color ranges to make specific isolated adjustments in black and white. So if I want to brighten up just his face, now I don't have to make a complicated mask or selection to do that. Right? Again, what I would do for this image, probably wouldn't do black and white. I actually like the color, but what's the subject? It's him, right? And it's his kind of like, I just caught him in this one moment. He's a shop owner. I was just walking around the shop and I took this one image. I just kind of love like that puzzled kind of look. I don't know exactly what he was trying to say. So I'm going to go to crop. Right? Does that have more impact? Because he's the subject. Just a simple crop makes all the difference in the world sometimes, where you wouldn't think about it until you see the before and then the after. It's his look, it's his eyes, it's his face, that's the subject. Nothing else is really a subject. In fact, if I wanted to darken even more, I could probably get away with just going to the vignette and kind of darken the edges. If I really want to do it properly, I would go to this radial tool, select him, invert it, and kind of darken that even further. Right? That's our before, that's our after. How are we doing with the time here? We got some time, good. All right. Good. All right. Let's take a look at this one. So this is one of my best friends when I was in Kenya. She would wake me up every morning, really, like with horns poking through the tent. It was a problem when it rained. And then I realized when I got back, they reached out and they were like, this is a kudu, by the way. My first introduction to kudu was when I ate one at a barbecue in London, and I never heard of it before. Now Lisa became my best friend. And they were like, nope, all the males have horns. So you don't want to call her Lisa. I still call her Lisa. All right, so how would I adjust this, right? We were trying to get, like I was showing before, the kind of hero shots, and she was following me around everywhere. So we kind of decided to get a little profile shot of her, kind of short lighted her. So I want to bring up the brightness a little bit, right? That's Kilimanjaro in the background, by the way. How else would I adjust this, right? What's the subject? It's a kudu, right? What's the brightest part of the image? Not her. So how would I make that adjustment? I would start by using this radial filter tool, inverting it, darkening it down. But you'll notice right away, it kind of just selected the middle portion of the image. So what I can do is either I can brush it out or I can kind of mask it. Just to show you that again, I'll brush it out. Go to Auto Mask, choose a little feather, turn O for overlay on so I can see what I'm doing. I can kind of brush in here. Now if I kind of go over parts, first of all I can hit Shift O and that will change the colors, make it a little bit easier to see depending on the image. And so if I paint it over the legs, if I hold the Option key down, Alt on a PC, I can, what we call spring-loaded keys, I can temporarily load up my brush tool, the opposite of it, so I can brush back in the area that I want to. Except the Auto Mask isn't on. I'd probably want to turn Auto Mask on, so it preserves those edges. Then I can come back in here, paint back in. I can go back and forth just by holding that Option key down, something like that. All right, I'll paint that back in so I got the face as well. Get the horns. That's too much. Draw this edge over here and call that good. Go for overlay. Now we actually have two discrete ways to adjust the image. I can either darken the background or I can brighten up the foreground. How do I brighten up the foreground? Well, I just brighten up the whole image. Now I just brightened up everything, come back over here, and then darken the foreground. You start making extreme adjustments, you'll see that halo. It's not a problem. You can just paint that mask in. So you get it exactly how you need it to. Right? Everything's non-destructive, so you're not kind of stuck.
Which slider did you just change?
I didn't change any slider, I'm just adjusting the mask right now. But I would adjust just the exposure. I would darken down the exposure. I wouldn't do that much, but I would do is maybe warm this up a little bit and add some dehaze to give some contrast to this. And now I'd also maybe go to the dehaze tool, add dehaze to the whole thing. I would warm up the entire image. And again, you have to be careful with lighting. The nice little trick when you're lighting is if you put it on motor drive, right? Most flashes have a recycle time of at least 1 or 2 seconds. And most cameras have a motor drive of at least 5 images per second. Put on a motor drive, that first flash is going to pop, the second one won't. And then you can just kind of mask in that darker exposure. But for this, I would just bring my gradient tool, darken down that foreground. Right? If I wanted to, I can come in here and I can either add another gradient tool or I can just kind of paint. Over here. That's too much. In fact, let's do it too much. I can always come back and just tweak it, right? It's all non-destructive, so it doesn't actually make a difference. Add some more vibrance to this, add some, probably would add a little bit of warmth. And that's how we go from that to that.
What's behind her hind legs? Is that a ghost?
Oh, so that's actually the mask, because it's not a perfect mask. So if I wanted to tweak the mask, I'd come back to my brush tool, and I would find the mask. In fact, it wasn't the brush tool, it was my radial tool. Right? I can click on that icon, it'll take me right back to where I left off. I can hit O for overlay. In fact, I don't even need to do the overlay. I can kind of zoom in here, and I can see where it went wrong, right over there. And go to my brush tool, and just fix it at any time. Right, this is where having a larger monitor does make a difference. But again, it's all non-destructive. So at any time you can realize that. Someone can come back to you and say, hey, what happened? You just tweak it. If you're using Photoshop, it does make it more complicated, especially if you're not using layers, because then you have to go back and undo a whole bunch of steps. You can fix anything or do anything in any order at any time. That's why we call it nonlinear workflow. Okay, let's talk about some other advanced techniques. HDR. Right, look at the histogram here. It's not bad, but you'll notice that it's starting to creep on the right, starting to creep on the left. I can probably get away with this, but I also shot this with brackets to show you the process. Right, so now I'm capturing a little bit more detail in the highlights and in the sun, and now I'm capturing a lot more detail in the shadows. Right, so often you run into the situation where we're not actually able to capture the dynamic range that our eyes see. So this is how you do it. You just bracket your images. The newer phones, including the iPhone, have an HDR feature that works remarkably well, but it is limited. I'll put it that way. Having a bracket of raw exposures is always going to be your better bet. So all you do is you take that exposure, and you hit Control
Select all three if you bracket?
H. You're going to select the bracket of images. So if you bracketed 5 or 7 images, you're going to select that. There are ways to automate that if you do bracketing a lot. There's this option called stacking. If you come down here to stacking, and you can say auto stack by capture time. Right? And what that will do, anything you see with 3 dots, there's options. What that will do is group everything into stacks based upon the interval that you set. So if you're bracketing, for instance, you're going to want to, ideally, you're going to want to have it on a tripod and have it, but not always. But what you do want to do is put it on motor drive, so that when you hold it down, it's going to take 3 pictures instantly, or 5 pictures or 10 pictures instantly, right? Because clouds move, branches move, cars move, whatever, right? So if you say that time between stacks is literally 1 second, you're probably just going to capture all of your bracketed images, and it'll automatically put them in a group. So interesting is that when we do this, we can do it manually just by looking at it, honestly. That's an easy way to do it. What I do, and I teach this in the workshop that I'm doing next weekend, is you have all this information available right here at your fingertips on this grid view. Right? Hit G to go into our grid view. If you right click on any one of these, you can change the information that's being showed on that overview grid kind of layout. So you can change common attributes. There's one for exposure and ISO, and there should be one for exposure bias. Here we go. So now it's going to show you, here this is your normal exposure, 0. Here's your -2, and here's +2. So you don't have to go into the image to understand what that bracketed sequence is. Right, so you'd select all 3. Option H, sorry, Control H, and then proceed. Auto align is going to be really handy, especially if you're not on a tripod. You do have auto settings. I usually don't use that. And you have this deghosting option. It works pretty well, but all it's going to do is, if there was like a child playing on the side that's going to in different spot in all the frames, or even if there's a lot of motion with the wind, it's going to try and mask one of the images out so you don't have this kind of ghosting and overlay. right? So you can try it with different things, and then you have this option to go back to your point, create stack, right? So what that's going to do is going to take all 3 of these images, create a single HDR raw file, and that's the key here, is that it's using math, where every other program, Photoshop, Aurora, what's the other one? There's a couple HDR programs out there, Photomatics. They're all using pixels, right? So you need a TIFF file, you need an actual pixel-based file. This is using math, which means this computation created the raw file. So you always have access to the original, all of the information. You're not compressing anything, and you don't actually wind up with technically even another file. It's referencing the original raw files. So it gives you the best possible quality. I can stack that, and if I do, it's going to create a raw file. And because I don't know why there's one of the images missing, it's going to try and send it, but if I did this properly, you would get the raw file, right? You do need access to the original exposures to do this. I think one of them might have been missing, it said. And then what you'll wind up is something that looks like this, which kind of looks identical to the first one, right? If you look at the top right here, one is a raw file, one's an HDR. But what you'll see is with an HDR file, we can now take our exposure slider and recover all of the highlight detail and bring our shadow detail all the way up. We have a much larger range. It's a 32-bit floating point file is what they call it. All that really means is now we can make global adjustments, bring the highlights down, bring the shadows up, right? That's a start. Maybe warm it up a little bit, add a little color temperature, add a little vibrance. Do you know the difference between vibrance and saturation, by the way? All right, this is actually really important. Vibrance is an intelligent saturation. So you see this saturation slider over here? Forget about it. Just pretend it's not there. Basically, it's an older way of doing it. It just makes everything more saturated. What vibrance is going to do is look at the areas, intelligently look at the image, and look at the areas that are already saturated and not saturate them as much. And will only saturate the areas that need more saturation, the areas that have less saturation. It will also protect against skin tones, right? So if you have people in the image, it won't saturate their skin, make them look orange. I won't insert any political information here at all. But if we use our gradient tool, now I can select just the sky, and I can bring this down. I can maybe warm this up a little bit. Maybe add just a little bit of negative texture, just kind of soften things out. I can come over here to the global adjustments and add more texture and clarity. So I have isolated ways of selecting different regions of the image, right? If I wanted to select these flowers, how would I do that? Right, I think this is maybe a little bit too dark, so I'm going to bring that back and just recover the highlights a little bit more. Add a little bit more warmth to the image. Right, I want to add a little bit more texture to this. First, I think really just having a little bit of vignette is going to help to kind of bring the eye into the scene a little bit. If I want to add more detail to these flowers, take the whites, maybe just a little bit of the exposure. I can kind of paint, which is great, but it's painting everything again. If I want to isolate just the flowers, range mask, this time I can select color. And I can select just that color purple. And you'll notice now, when I drag this over, it's selecting only that color. Now I can make those brighter. I can even change the color and opacity if I wanted to, sharpness, clarity, and really make those stand out. And I can do the same thing with those. Right, just kind of make them stand out a bit. If I wanted to adjust the grass, how would I do that? You haven't used this one yet. HSL. It's sort of like a middle ground between our global exposure and our target adjustments, because it's going to select just the color green. Right, so I can take the green. If I wanted to make this more saturated, I can come over here to green, and I can saturate it. or I can desaturate it. That's the wrong way to do it. Right? I want to show you the wrong way to do it. Why? Is because there's not just always green in any, there's not only just one color in every image, there's multiple colors, right? Most things are made up of multiple colors. You wouldn't know what color to choose, especially in which ratio. So if you come over here to this target adjustment tool over here, I can hover over the grass. And when I do that, now I can adjust the saturation, and you'll realize that there's actually more yellow than there is green. Right? But it's making a much more accurate selection from a standpoint of color, because it's selecting all the underlying colors.
How are you moving the sliders with your arrows?
I'm hovering over the color that I want to adjust, and I'm clicking and dragging up and down.
Oh.
That's all I'm doing. So I'm selecting saturation or hue or luminance, depending on what do I want to adjust. If I want this grass to be brighter, now I can select this. For those of you that really like shortcuts, there's a shortcut for this. It's Shift, Control, Command H for hue, Shift, Control, Command S for saturation, Shift, Control, Command L for luminance. I don't expect you guys to remember it. I'm not going to quiz you this time. Next time I might. So there isn't too much else I would do. I'd probably come over here to my tone curve again, brighten this up a little bit, bring the whole thing darken just to create a little bit more drama, something like that, and then bring the shadows back up. Maybe add just a little bit more texture and clarity and call that a day. I probably would, just because of sunset again, go to my split toning and add just a little bit of warmth. Right, and you notice what a difference that makes. That's our before, that's our after. Right, it makes a big difference, but they're not really complicated adjustments once you get an idea of what we're trying to do, right? You're just kind of normalizing the photo and adding color and light where you need it. And these flowers obviously needed some punch, so we're just exaggerating that. Let's look at these.
That was taken with your iPhone.
That was taken with my iPhone. Yeah, that was at Cliffs of Moher in Ireland. So this is, again, because when I started shooting with my phone, I realized, I have to overcome all these hurdles. One of them was resolution, the other one was dynamic range. So I started bracketing multiple raw files, putting them in HDR, bringing them into Lightroom. But resolution was another one too. Right, so I can take a 12 megapixel image and turn it into a 20 megapixel, or a 60 or 100 megapixel image. So I just take individual shots just like that, and we can stitch them into just a panoramic image. Merge to panorama, and then it's going to spit this out. That's the before, that's the after. Right, so I'm creating that glow, which we really didn't talk about yet too much. So let's do that. We'll still get on time. So first, the crop. This is actually what it's going to look like. You do have the option when you create a panoramic to auto crop. R for the crop tool. And I like to just do this manually, and I can just crop this out. Crop this out. The reason is, with a panorama, you don't wind up with a normal ratio the way you do with other images. Right? So it tends to be a little bit wider. So I can unlock this checkbox, hit L for lights out, and I can capture the entire width right up into the edge. All right, now what else are we going to do? We want to add that glow. We want to add some drama. We want to add the color that I saw when I was there. Right? Intentionally put the sun behind this tree so it wouldn't be completely blown out. And everything is becoming, the leaves are becoming backlit. So I want to showcase that. I'm going to make the whole thing brighter. Then I'm going to bring down those highlights to retain the detail. I'm going to add whites a little bit. I'm going to go to my tone curve. I'm going to brighten that up a little bit. And maybe some shadow detail. I'm just going to play around with these sliders until I get a little bit more retaining of the highlight and the shadow detail. I will warm this image up a little bit more. That alone makes a huge difference. And which of the two sliders am I going to use, Vibrance or Saturation?
Vibrance.
Vibrance. Just those sliders, and that's just the basic panel, right? So we've covered a lot of information. We didn't talk too much about the difference between texture, clarity, and dehaze. This will give us a better idea. Texture is just going to bring up, if I zoom this in a little bit, Texture is going to bring out some of the details, the very small details, like in the edges of those leaves. Where clarity is going to give us a lot more contrast. I usually don't like using clarity too much because it does adjust the color relationship and the contrast relationship too. So I feel like texture is going to be a little bit better of a bet. And then dehaze will just bring back a lot of that color and contrast back as well. So with those sliders, now we're getting somewhere, right? We want to add even more color and punch and a little bit of a glow to this, right? So how do we do that? Well, we haven't really talked about this yet, but the sun's behind this tree. We want to create these kind of beams, right? So one way we can do that is to simulate it. Add a little bit more warmth, a little bit of exposure, a little bit of whites. And you should bring the clarity down just a little bit. Now what I do is I turn auto mask off, turn my brush down low, and I would just kind of paint. In fact, I would turn the density down a little bit so it's not as obvious. Just start kind of painting, and you notice that I'm going right back to the source, and I'm painting outward. And because after I made these adjustments, I can come back in and I can adjust however I want to. Right, so I can add a little bit more warmth to this, add a little bit of negative clarity, which is going to give me a little bit of that glow. That's our before, that's our after. I can exaggerate that a little bit more if I really wanted to, just to kind of give you an idea of the effect. Can you see the difference? Now, if I like that and I want to apply that to other images, where it says custom over here, I can click on it. These are basically presets for your brush tool. Come over here and I can say save current settings. And I can label that sun rays demo, because I already have a sun rays one. Right? And that's how you can save it so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Once you have a certain brush that you like, you can use it over and over and over again. If I wanted to add this even more, radial shift tool, select the tree right where that sun is, and I would probably go to my luminance and reduce the shadows so it's only kind of affecting the highlights. Essentially, it's not affecting the tree. I don't want to affect the sharpness of the tree, but I do want this kind of warm glow on the outside, and then I would just bring this up a little bit and warm it up a little bit. Maybe add a little bit more, a little negative clarity and a little bit more saturation. And that's how we get from that to that. Is that starting to make sense? Do we have any questions on that? Right? I'm hoping that if I do this more and more and more, you'll start to see the decision-making process take place. This is something that we do next weekend for hours and hours and hours until everyone's kind of drilled into them. This visual workflow. It's very important. Once you understand it, you're never going to be at a guess as to what to do with your images. That's the whole point. When I learned all these tips and tricks and I went to these videos and got all these books, it sounded great. And then I look at my images and I was, well, where do I start? Where do I what slider do I choose first? Right? And how would you even know?
And the last one with the tree, is there anything you would do so it doesn't
This
look
one?
like there's eternity behind the tree? Is there anything you do with that bright light?
Well, I like that bright light personally. It depends on how you captured it. If you captured it with a HDR raw file and you retained all the highlight detail, you can. But to me, again, I want to retain all the information in an image, but if it's not relevant, I don't mind it being blown out, because I know that your eye's going to go to the brightest part of the frame. So if I want your eyes to go to where this tree is and then go outward, keeping that blown out a little bit means that your eye's always going to go to the middle of that frame. Right? If there's something really, like a really beautiful sunset, then certainly I would have come down here and I would have brought the highlights all the way back. I would have retained that information, made sure I captured it as an HDR raw file. For me, that's not as critical in this image the way it is in other images. This is actually a good example. -2, +2, and that's your HDR. Right? You can't capture, and this will happen a lot when you're shooting indoor and outdoor scenes. You can't capture the detail on both. It's actually very difficult to do. They're massively different exposures. So you capture one for the highlights, one for the shadows. You do want to be careful with the one for the shadows because your shutter speed, you'll notice your shutter speed here is 1800th, right? Here it's 1/20th of a second. If your shutter speed starts getting slower and slower because you need a brighter image, you can wind up with a blurry image on your brightest. So you want to check your brightest picture when you're bracketing and you're hand holding it to make sure that it's not going to be too soft or blurry. And then you can just merge the two.
What happens if you change the ISO? The quality?
So the question is, what happens if you change the ISO? You don't want to use the ISO to bracket your images because your ISO doesn't do anything. I know it's a weird thing to think about. There's only two ways you can add light to your image. And what we're trying to do is capture the range of light, right? The dark image, then the bright image. If we use our ISO, all we're doing is turning the volume up, the gain on our camera. We're not actually increasing the amount of light that's touching the sensor. So it won't change the image quality. If you want to capture the bright exposure without any artifacts or noise, you actually want to add more light to the sensor. There's only two ways you can add more light to the sensor. Aperture and shutter speed. Right? Your ISO is basically there just so you can see what's going on in the back of the camera. For the most part, right? For the newer cameras that are ISO invariant. There is a little bit of a quality gain for some of the older cameras. The Canon cameras, I believe, as well. Sony cameras, it actually doesn't make a difference. If you're on a tripod, you just want to increase the amount of light. That's what actually is going to change the quality of the image. So we're capturing both of those. We wind up with an HDR image, because if we took this bright image and we try to bring it down, this is what we're going to get. This is why you don't overexpose an image. You can't recover those highlights. And if we brought our shadow details up, see all that noise? It's going to look terrible. Why is all that noise there? It's because noise is literally a lack of information. And like I said at the beginning of this, digital photography is just capturing light. Light is converted into information. So noise only shows up in the shadows because it's literally a lack of light. It's a lack of information, right? So if you get a brighter image, you won't see noise because there's enough light there. There's information there. All that noise is just, they're trying to make up information that doesn't really exist there. So if we bracket it, put them together in HDR, then we have full creative control. It's going to look exactly like the previous one, right? Except now I can take the highlights, bring it down, shadows, bring it up. Go to my tone curve, bring that up, bring the shadows up even more. Let's do something like that. Maybe bring the blacks up. Now if I wanted a little bit more, I already brought my shadows up all the way, I would overexpose this. Then I can come in here with my radial tool and just bring the highlights back down again. And then my exposure back up. Just to kind of exaggerate this for effect. Probably arrange this so it's only affecting the highlights. There we go. Now if you look at the difference, we try to match that exposure here. It's not even going to let us. Now if you want to compare two images, I'm going to hit the C key. Now which do you guys prefer? Right? That's why we shoot HDR. Especially when you have a smaller sensor. Like I figured all these things when I started shooting with a phone. So I love the idea of just being able to put it in my pocket and go anywhere with it. So now I draw the line where I have to carry something to carry something. Like I don't want to carry a camera bag, so I need to put cameras in it. So it fits in my pocket. But this is how you get around those little limitations, right? And this will apply to any camera you're using. If you have a dynamic range that looks like this, pure black when you expose properly for the highlights, and pure white when you expose properly for shadows. Capture that full range, super easy to do in Lightroom. Just put the two together, just Control H, and it's going to give you an HDR image. You right click, photo merge, HDR, right? And it will even know if you have multiple images. So you can have an HDR panoramic, and it will build in one click an HDR panoramic, which will solve the issue of both dynamic range and also field of view. Something to keep in mind. Crop. We didn't talk about this yet. I said I was going to go into. This is New Jersey, right on the other side of the bridge. I have the GW right at my back. So this, again, this is just a panoramic. Wow, I think mosquito did not like that joke. So what I would do is crop it. But again, I can just crop out this part, and that's fine. And I unlock this. But what I like to do when I have a panoramic, or even when I have regular images, I have to crop to like an anamorphic format. It's a cinematic format. What you see when you go to a movie theater, you have that super wide angle. Sometimes it just looks really cool, but it works really well in landscapes. Because here, all the information that I wanted to really show is right in the middle. Right? So what I can do is, if I come down to crop ratio, all I do is click on original. I can do enter custom. I can either do 3:1 is the easy one, but it's really 2.39. Click OK. And it's going to give me this kind of anamorphic widescreen feel. Hit L again for lights out. I can kind of, now if I grab the corners, I can also rotate if it's not perfect. So I never, the first thing I do when I get a camera is turn off that auto level. I don't understand it. It's literally this simple. In fact, it's even simpler, right? You can automate. You click auto and it will just find the line for you. It'll automatically level it. So I don't ever really worry about it. It is a little bit more critical when you have a lot of panoramas, right? Because then you are going to crop off. But for normal images, not a bother. All right, what's going to work really well right off the bat here? Right, look at my histogram. Everything's kind of in the middle. It's muddy. I need to drag the contrast out, brights and darks. First of all, the auto key. That helps a little bit, right? It's actually very intelligent these days. Adobe is using something called Adobe Sensei, an AI algorithm that it's more complex than just dragging the sliders around and taking a guess. It's used a whole algorithm that relies basically on information about a large range of photographers that post-process images. So anyway, the dehaze is really what's going to bring that out. But then it kind of changes the color a little bit, so I might just warm that back up again. And that looks a little too green, so I'll add a little bit more magenta. And now we're starting to get somewhere. Maybe some texture is going to bring that out. Some contrast, so I'll bring the highlights down a little bit more. I'm starting to get those God rays, right? Just those like simple adjustments. That's all we're doing, which is kind of cool. I probably, since this is a sunset, I do want to add a little bit more warming. So I'll bring that out a little bit. And then the information where do I want to draw the eye is right into the middle where these God rays are, right? But right now it's kind of, and you're going to run into this a lot, the light's kind of like even, right? So what I want to do is change that. What tool could I use to change that? I'm going to use a gradient tool and just drag down and just darken the top. Maybe add a little bit of contrast. Maybe a little bit of dehaze. No, dehaze is going to change the color. Maybe a little bit of clarity. There you go, just a little bit. I'm also going to do the same from the bottom. Something like that. I'm going to make that a little more drastic. I'm going to H to hide it, and you'll see just with that one tool, it's something that you shouldn't notice. It's like makeup, right? You shouldn't notice until you take it away. And so you would never notice that that's what we did. It's sort of like a vignette, but it's the whole top and bottom part of the image. In fact, I could probably add a vignette as well, and that wouldn't hurt. Because I want to focus your eye right in the middle of the frame, and it actually is in the middle of the frame now. I can take the roundness, the feather off so I can see where I want to adjust this and what shape I want this to be. And then double click that to zero back out. Before, after, right? You can't get this in camera You're not going to get this look in camera. You capture the raw ingredients in camera, but this, you have to visualize this. This is what I can do with this image. If you get to the point where you look at the back of your camera and you see this, and you're thinking in your mind, you're seeing this, you're in a good spot, right? And seeing this will help you inform you when you're going out shooting in the future, and you're looking at the back of your camera. I got that shot, I can move on, right? Don't throw it away. How else would we do this further? Well, we can burn and dodge. We already have our sun rays. I can start there. I can go to my brush tool, click on custom, and I should have, here we go, warm light rays. Probably make this smaller to simulate the light rays. Probably change the feather a little bit. I can kind of drag that out. Accentuate that just a little bit. That's obviously going to be way too much, but it doesn't matter because I can bring that down just very, very, very subtly. In fact, I might even see if the dehaze is going to bring that out further. And really what I do is I want to do the opposite as well. So I'm going to hit K and K again. That's a shortcut for brush. Now I have a new brush. Right, I could just click new as well. Now I'm going to darken things down a little bit and add a little more contrast. I can kind of paint in here as well. It's very basic, but it's just there to kind of show you that it's something you can use to accentuate it. Double click this, and just a little bit of contrast is all you need. It should be very subtle. Right, can you see that difference? You're just adding a little bit of mood to the image. And I'm just accentuating those God rays. That's all. It's even a little bit too much, but I wanted it so you can actually see what I'm doing. That's it. We didn't talk about HSL much, but it's also something you want to consider is we can adjust the hue. Click this target adjustment tool, and we can tweak the hue. So if that looked a little too yellow, we can tweak that. We can also adjust the luminance if that was too bright. Hover over there, and I can bring that detail back just in that brightest part of the image. Right? I could also use the radial filter tool and highlight and just mask by the highlights, but this is just a little bit easier to use. Right? So that's our before, that's our after. It's supposed to look like this. It's like being in a recording studio. It wants to capture the entire range of information. And it's your job, and it doesn't have to be complicated to get that, because that's what you want to pre-visualize. But you're not going to get that in camera. You shouldn't necessarily get that in camera. You should capture all the details. And again, have a simple way of doing this. Questions about that? How are we looking on time here? 2 minutes. Okay, well then, I will leave it at that. Let's just say, if you do have any questions, again, I'll bring up my information. Send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know it's a lot to take in. This is kind of the fun part, but it can sound like a little complicated. If you do this over and over and over again, feel free to watch this, slow it down, look what I was doing. For those of you that are in the audience or those that are in the tri-state area, next weekend, Saturday and Sunday, this is a deep dive on literally everything we need to know. We cover this, but we do everything else. Workflow, digital asset management, how to share your images, how to social media, how to do everything with them, right? From soup to nuts, everything about Lightroom. This is a part of it, but this is a really important part. If you have questions about how to process, questions about anything at all, Lightroom-wise or just photographically, send me an email. I'm happy to help you out, and we'll take it from there. You can also look at my website. I have resources on there as well. The gear that I use, there's apps that I use, some of the older presentations. This will be recorded and be on B&H's website as well. If you don't see it, reach out to me. I'll get you a link. But again, thank you so much for coming out. I'm really happy you did. If you have any questions, reach out anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you.